Alright, me. It is September, and I just finished reading The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, which is the second book in the Hitchhiker's Guide series. And I mean, first of all, I read this book in one sitting this morning, probably about 2 hours or so. Like with most of these books, they're not very long books, but they are just very dense in terms of what they have to say. So I just keep that in mind, right? So this probably won't be as thorough as it could be, just because I did read through this very quickly. But the book itself, right? Book is fascinating, right? Because, right, as kind of previously mentioned with a lot of different science fiction books, it's a time to like kind of explore ideas in a way that you normally wouldn't get to in more traditional stylized fiction, right? And Douglas Adams, throughout this whole series, is really based around a lot of life philosophy and asking questions about how do we exist in this way, right? So really, I would argue that the big main philosophical question that he is asking throughout this entire book has to do exactly with the restaurant at the end of the universe, which is, you know, how do we live and exist once we know the end, right? Once we know the end, once we've seen the end, how do we handle that, right? And there's kind of three sections to this that like really kind of show kind of different viewpoints, I would argue, right? And it is The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, which is actually the second one shown, but it kind of goes with this argument of like, you want to know so badly, but you are just so fearful of it. And once you've seen it, you don't really know how to handle yourself, right? And we get this a lot from just the other people that are there, right? Because we get our four main characters of Zafad, we get Ford, and then Arthur and Trillian are there. But like, it's just this concept of like, how do I put this? Of like, everyone else that we kind of meet has chosen to go to the restaurant at the end of the universe. You don't just get there, like you have to travel through time to get there, right? And so people have made this conscious decision to see the end, right? They have made the decision that they want to see the end, and then they see it and they don't know how to handle themselves, right? They are so scared by what is happening, right? Because like we have Maximilian, who's kind of like the host of everything that's going on in the restaurant at the end of the universe, and like he's trying to like get like some sort of basic audience engagement that you would get from like a host like this, and like he's talking about what they're seeing, and he's talking about how, you know, this star that they're seeing is actually this star. Anyone else here from this star, right? And like every single response is mired in fear, because this is it. This is the end, right? And someone like Maximilian has seen the end a million times, so he is no longer faced by it. But all these other people that are seeing the end for the first time, they just don't know how to react, right? There is no, they have seen the end game, and now there's a fear on how to proceed, right? So that's, one way to think about it. The other way is from the torture machine that they sentenced Zafad to. I'm trying to remember the name. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but right, it's basically what it's trying to do is show the perspective and the size of the universe and show how small you are in comparison, right? And it's described that, like, through all the times that it has been used, everyone else goes insane by it, right? Because of this idea of relativistic scale. Once you get rid of that scale and you only have the real thing, and you recognize how small and how insignificant you are in comparison, right, it drives people insane, right? Once you recognize the end game or the end goal of that you inherently do not matter because of how small you are compared to everything else, then, right, it drives people insane. Unless you have a very specific viewpoint of it, right? As described, the way the machine works is like it takes a piece of fairy cake and analyzes all of the matter that's in it. And because of the Big Bang and, this idea that all matter has interacted with other pieces of matter, well, what you can do then is you can basically go backwards through time and measure out the entirety of everything that has happened by analyzing the interactions between atoms, right? Because if every atom has at least interacted with two other atoms, I should say it has at least interacted with two other atoms, so a total of 3 atoms has interacted with, you might get some loops. But in the end, right, even though there might be a loop here, there's a third one that connects. It may connect to another loop, but that one connects to another loop, that one connects to another loop, right? And so, right, you can, in theory, be able to analyze the entirety of the history of the universe through its interactions with atoms, right? And that's what the machine does, right, is like, through that process, right, it shows you how insignificant, how small you are. But also in that sense, right, you can make an argument that it shows you how big you are in scale of the universe, right? That, right, in the same way that it can analyze a piece of fairy cake, you have that same exact connection, right? That you are connected to everything else in the universe. And in that way, you can argue that you are the most important person, right? Because you are inherently connected to everything else that has ever existed because of your connection through your atoms, right? And so, right, we get this concept of like, some people, once they have seen the end and seen the scale and seen how insignificant they are, because they view it as insignificance, they lose it and they go insane. But if you can make the argument that you are just like that piece of fairy cake and you are inherently connected to everything else that exists in the world, well, then all of a sudden you are the most important thing that has ever existed because you are inherently connected to everything else. Right? So that's another way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is what happens when we meet the person who runs the universe, right? That's been one of the key points throughout the first book and a half, is this concept that Zaphod has stolen the heart of gold because his mind has told him to, and the reasoning behind that is because he's going to try to meet the person who runs the world, and is in charge of the universe, right? Because he as president doesn't actually control it in any way, right? So eventually they find a way to go and meet this person. And this person, to an outside observer, right, I would argue, like, seems like this very naive, stupid person. But I would argue, like, anyone who's even like the kind of this basic idea of epistemology and understand, like, the study of what we know and why we know it, right? It's actually quite a profound idea, even with just a basic knowledge of epistemology, right? This is a person who cannot see the end and can never be at the end, even though he controls everything, even though people come and ask him questions, even though he in the end controls everything, he can never see the end, because he only ever views himself and everything else through an understanding that his perceptions are very, very limited, right? That he in himself can perceive things, but not inherently perceive them correctly because of his limited view of the world through his senses, right? And so therefore, there can never be an end because there's only ever a present existence, right? Even the past, as mentioned a couple times throughout the book, is history in of itself is a recollection between what the mind has perceived and time passing, right? And those perceptions get warped through the idea of time passing, and therefore history is not actually a concrete idea. It is something that we can perceive, but inaccurately, not to its fullest extent, right? And so therefore, to live life, one must live only through the present, and only through the idea that our perceptions and our senses, although useful, are inherently biased and do not give us a full picture of what is happening, right? And the idea of belief in any sort of way of something that we cannot physically in some way sense is then wrong, right? You know, even things like the perception of rain, right? This is actually a very famous argument. I don't remember who it's proposed by, but like it's one of the first things that you kind of like look at when you look at epistemology, or at least when I was looking at epistemology and being taught epistemology. This was the first things we looked at is what is the concept of being wet, right? Does rain make you wet? Because for other people it could make them wet, but then only through your perception of their perception. And even, you know, in the idea of standing out in the rain, what is that perception of being wet? Is it that you're actually wet, or is that your mind telling you that you should feel wet because there is rain, right? It's a fascinating kind of idea, right? Of like this living in the present, because that is the only thing that we can exist through, but also what is perception? So that's all of the argument. And finally, we get the argument that is made by the very end through Ford and through Arthur, right? They get teleported 2 million years into the past from where they should have been. and they get put on the ship, and the ship crash lands onto Earth. And what happens is they see the ancestral Homo sapiens, the Neanderthals that exist, but also the fact that there is a group of people that are very, very similar to humans that get exiled there because they're all kind of like this middle management type group, right? And, or like they do jobs that are not necessarily considered beneficial towards a productive society, right? And what they see is that the people that they've actually descended from and the people that are in the experiment, right? Because we talked about last time how the Earth is supposed to be an experiment to figure out the big question. Well, what ends up happening is those people that are actually the experiment are going to die out because the people that have crash landed there are taking over all the niches, right? And they are going to basically fulfill the role. And so we get this kind of meddled thing, and Arthur realizes, and Ford realizes that Arthur's actually descended from these alien creatures that would become what we know as humans, and not the Neanderthal type people. And we figure out that although Arthur has the question in him somewhere, it is probably muddled. It is probably not correct. And so they kind of figure out that it's a subconscious thing, and they start pulling fake or letters basically out of a hat for Arthur to spell something. And it ends up being a wrong equation to get to 42, right? And it is basically a form of like absurdism, right? That all of these things have happened, right? We talk about improbability. Probably is also a huge factor in all of these books. The improbability of all of this happening to lead to the improbable answer of 6 by 9 somehow equaling 42. But, right, the decision then becomes that they can't get off this planet, right? Because, as Ford will later come to realize, when he was first on Earth, is that no one ever comes over here. So therefore, there's no way really off this island, off this planet. And in 2 million years, this planet's going to go anyway. So who really cares? So what else is there to do when you know the end? You know that this planet is going to be destroyed, and you know that this entire experiment is going to fail. What are you going to do in the meantime? You're just going to say fuck it and party. You're just going to say fuck it and live life the best way that you can, right? Because that is the last and final way to really think about the world and think about knowing the end, right? We have this idea of you can never know the end, and then you have this idea that you are scared once you've seen the end. You have this idea that you become the most important thing once you've seen the end. And then you have this idea that you just continue on as you were before once you've seen the end, right? That even though you've seen the end, you still have to get there, right? Even though that there is this end goal that exists that you already know, it takes time to get there. It takes time to get to the end. So even though we know it, we can still enjoy the journey to get there, right? But yeah, that is Douglas Adams' Restaurant at the End of the Universe. Not much else I can really say at this point in time about it. I'm excited to finish it. However, I'm reading a whole bunch of other stuff for school, so, who knows when I'll be able to finish it. But yeah, that is the second book.